Well, hello everyone and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. For the past 40 years, Efraim Zuroff has worked with one goal in mind, bringing perpetrators of the Holocaust to justice. Based in Israel, his work for the Simon Wiesenthal Center has taken him all over the world, from Argentina to the Balkans and even Egypt. His latest work has taken him down a different and equally challenging path. It's a book about the Holocaust in Lithuania. It's called Our People, and it's co-authored with the Lithuanian journalist Rūta Vanagaitė. Efraim, I think you're in Jerusalem, I'm right at the moment, and welcome to Insight.
Yes, I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, the holy city.
Very good. Well, it's going to be a great discussion, a really gripping one and challenging one as well. In a moment, we're going to discuss the shocking nature of the Holocaust in the Baltics, which is a story that I think some people won't be familiar with. And just as crucially, we're going to talk about the way the region has dealt with its history. But before we get into all of that, I want to ask you a very basic question is how did you start with this work? I can't imagine that Nazi hunter was a career choice offered at school.
You're right. It wasn't offered where I went to school.
And where was that? Tell us about that. How did you get it? How did it all start?
Listen, it's very interesting because very often after I give a lecture or some other event, people come up to me and they tell me, and it's usually children and grandchildren of survivors, that I have their dream job. When they were growing up, they were dreaming of being Nazi hunters. And I unfortunately have to disappoint them and tell them that my fantasy growing up was to be the first Orthodox Jew to play in the NBA.
What went wrong?
What went wrong? First of all, I wasn't good enough, to be honest. And you can't really be an Orthodox Jew and play in the NBA. But the truth of the matter is just purely, I sometimes say there are two versions to this story. One is the mystical version. The other one is the practical version. Practical version was I was always very interested in history and especially Jewish history. And I was intrigued, if that's the word, about how the Holocaust was actually possible. How could such a horrific event take place? And I started studying at the Hebrew University. And
I think we've got a small alarm there, haven't we, in the background? I wonder if we can. Is that on your computer?
Is what on my computer?
There's a little alarm coming through. I don't know if that was
no,
whether you can put it at your end.
No, I don't think so.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
Anyway, so I studied graduate degree, initially a master's at the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, and you had to choose a specialization. And I originally thought that my path would be to the Israeli Foreign Ministry or the Jewish Agency, something to do with the Jewish people. That was my passion. But after I got to Jerusalem and looked at the program, it was obvious that this program was not designed to train people in the field, but rather to train scholars. So, my parents said, a BA is not enough. I have to get at least an MA. So if I'm going to have to deal with the subject intellectually, the thing that really I was curious about was the Holocaust and how it could happen. And that was my specialty, my specialization. And what happened was that I had to go to the United States at some point when my doctoral, my PhD program subject was approved. And while I was there, the US government started prosecuting Nazi war criminals who had come to the country, posing as innocent refugees. Now, ironically, they didn't prosecute them for their crimes because the crimes were committed overseas and the victims were not Americans. So what they did, I jokingly call it the Al Capone compromise. In other words, people had violated immigration naturalization law because they were asked specific questions, which if answered honestly they never would have been allowed to enter the United States.
I remember the visa form. I don't know if they still have it. It said, were you or have you ever been a member of the Nazi Party and participated in war crimes between 1939 and 1945? So it's that clause that they broke, and that's the
right, precisely. And they also were asked to list all their places of employment, where they were, etc. In any event, I was approached by this Office of Special Investigations to assist them in convincing survivors to cooperate with them and to be willing to testify. And they were a new unit, had just been created, and they felt that if they would come with the recommendation of a Jewish organization, that would facilitate things, because very often survivors were wary of government, skeptical about how they'd be treated in all of this. And I was very happy to help them, to be honest. The guy who came to see me, an investigator by the name of Bill Crane, made such a good impression on me. I said to myself, 1 second, I spent most of my life studying the Holocaust. This guy's not even Jewish, and there must be some way I can help him. And I, tried to help them. We also came up with an idea of setting up a database of all the survivors in North America.
Efraim, I've got to interrupt you there, because unfortunately, your career has been enormous, and the number of stories that we could tell here are huge. I mean, I met you in the Balkans when you were looking at Jasenovats. In 1999, you were crucial in bringing a Croatian perpetrator involved with the concentration.
One of the commanders of Jasenovats,
Yeah, exactly. So there's Arabat Chaim, which you were trying to track down in Egypt, and there are numerous other stories, and they are. Each of those stories could involve a film being made about, what was done, where these people were in hiding, and how they were brought to justice, and in some cases, how they died before they were brought to justice. But I want us to shift to the Baltics, and the reason for me this is so fascinating and perhaps shocking as well is I remember when we did a tour in the Baltics, and I was in Vilnius, and I walked into this small museum. It's called the Little Green Museum.
The
greenhouse. And up on the wall, and we're going to bring up a map now, Isabel's going to bring up a map now, was a map of all the villages in Lithuania and Latvia in which there was a Jewish population. And I just didn't know. I just didn't know that there were the Litvak population, the Yiddish-speaking community of this area was huge. And they were all wiped out, and it's not just the fact that they were wiped out. We know obviously we know generally about the Holocaust, but it was the way in which this happened, which is different. I mean, just looking at this map here, just to give people an idea, there's Vilna, Kauna, that's Vilnius and Kaunas today, and we're looking at Minsk, the capital of Belarus there. And you've got areas going into Poland, Belarusia, and further across into Ukraine, I think, as well. So it's a huge area. But can you just start by saying what was different about the Holocaust here? I think most people are going to be familiar with Auschwitz, Treblinka. In most people's minds, you think about concentration camps and extermination camps. Why was this different?
Okay, those are really the icons of the history of the Holocaust. But here we're talking about the beginning of the systematic annihilation of European Jewry as part of the final solution. And this was carried out not by sending people to death camps, but rather by shooting. And as a matter of fact, the reason that the Nazis set up places like Auschwitz and Treblinka was because Himmler saw what a difficult impact the shootings had on the people who were carrying out the murders. And they wanted something much more sterile. So in places like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, Belarus, it's individual murder, face-to-face murder by shooting grenades, rifles, etc. In Lithuania, there were 220,000 Jews who lived under the Nazi occupation, 212,000 of whom were murdered by the Nazis and their helpers. Now, one of the facts that doesn't appear in the book itself, but which we subsequently learned, was that, believe it or not, there were less than 1,000 Germans in Lithuania during the Holocaust. Now, if you take into account what I explained, in other words, this is individual murder, face-to-face murder, how on earth could so few people carry out a mass, almost unprecedented mass murder operation? Well, the answer is that they had plenty of help.
Yeah, we've got a photo here. I think Isabel's just going to bring that up while you're talking, and this is just outside Vilnius. This is in the what's the name of the forest? I've forgotten the name of the forest.
Ponar. This is Ponar. They're digging the pits in Ponar. So the point is that what happened was that most people don't know the history, but in 1939, after the Germans invaded Poland from the west, the Russians invaded Poland from the east, and they occupied about a third of the eastern third of Poland, and about less than a month later, they turned over the city of Vilna, or Vilnius, that's today's Vilnius, or Wilno in Polish times, and its environs to the independent state of Lithuania. Now this meant that 80,000 Jews were added to the 165,000 Jews who already lived in Lithuania. And what happened was that in June of 40, the Russians invaded Lithuania, all the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and took them over and occupied them as basically as part of a secret clause in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. Now, during that period, the leadership of almost all the political parties in Lithuania escaped from Lithuania to Berlin, sat in Berlin and expressed support for the Nazi regime and prepared for the Nazi invasion of Lithuania and started sending messages into the country about the day of reckoning that was going to come with the Jews, for the Jews. And our Jews had lived in Lithuania since the 14th century, and they had been granted freedom of worship, freedom of occupation by Gediminas, or Vytautas, I think it was, the Duke of, who ruled Lithuania, and later by Gediminas. And the level of anti-Semitism in Lithuania was not unusual. In other words, it was clear that if someone had said in the early 30s, let's say before the rise of the Nazis to power, that there were a catastrophe of unique proportions would be carried out against the Jews of Europe, and you ask them, where do you think it'll take place? The obvious answers were Poland, Romania, and Hungary. Once the Nazis came to power in Germany, you could add Germany to that list. But in Lithuania, the level of anti-Semitism was not unusual or particularly atrocious, but for a variety of reasons, many of them political, but not only political, once the Nazis came, situation was created whereby the local population was, I would even say, zealous in certain respects to collaborate. Part of this was a hope to achieve independence. They thought that the Germans would give them independence, although they had absolutely no intention of doing so. And same in Latvia, and same in Estonia, and Ukraine as well, by the way. And there were the long-standing Christian religious anti-Semitism. There were economic issues, the desire to steal the Jews' property and take over, and with absolutely horrific results. Now, part of the problem today, of course, is that the government does not deny that the Holocaust took place.
But before we get on to that, Efraim, I just wanted to just carry on a bit more with how this took place, because, well, I'm very keen for us to talk about the current history and how the current governments are dealing with this. But just before we get there, because I think this is really crucial to understand, the Holocaust was incredibly well documented in that region. We've got here, I think we've got a map here. I think this is by Stachlecker. Was a map showing the total number of killings that had taken place. Another possibly more famous report is by Jaeger, in which he documents every single village and how in each case the Jews were killed in those villages. And the descriptions are very precise, but they give you a clear idea of how it happened, of local villagers, volunteers within the police, marching hundreds of people from these villages out to graves that have been dug either by Soviet prisoners or by the villagers themselves, and then with those people being shot, and shot with very small numbers of German involvement, as you were saying just earlier. And this is the report that you can actually go and look it up online by Jaeger makes for absolutely shocking reading, doesn't it, Efraim?
Very shocking indeed, very precise. It's true that some figures here and there may not be entirely accurate, but the picture is absolutely clear. And in other words, most of the murders took place during the summer and fall of 1941. By 42, mid 42, there were only the large ghettos remained, not even fully intact, but partially intact. And those were the people who had survived the first wave of the murders, the ghettoization. And many of them were later subsequently murdered. Towards the end of the war, the remaining people who were in the ghettos were deported. The women mostly went to Stutthof, and the men to Dachau, and again with lethal results. So the number of survivors, only 8,000 Jews survived in Lithuania itself.
This brings us up to the book itself. You joined forces with a Lithuanian journalist, Rūta Vanagaitė, and this is what you were just talking about just now, that there has been a huge reluctance among both the political class, but also, I would say, Lithuanian society in general, in many ways, because they're unaware or reluctant to confront their own history. And that history is a very personal one. Could you just talk a bit about Rūta's own history, Rūta's own background?
Rūta was born in 1955 in Lithuania, and she only learned very late in life, about 5 years ago, that both her grandfather and her aunt's husband were active participants in the mass murder of Jews. Her grandfather prepared lists of communist activists, most of whom were Jewish, or many of whom were Jewish who were executed by the Nazis or by the Lithuanians. And her uncle, her aunt's husband, Stepuljonis, was the police chief of a city called Panevėžys, Panevėžys in Yiddish, which had close to 7,000 Jews, all of whom were murdered during the summer of 1941. He left his post in August 29th, 1941, but there's no, at least in some way, involved in the massacres of the Jews of Panevėžys. He ran away to America, by the way, and he actually died right before the US government set up a special office of special investigations to prosecute cases like his. He used to write to the family using a female name, and Rūta found out that he was involved, and her grandfather was involved. Her grandfather was put on trial after the war by the Soviets, and he was exiled to Kazakhstan, where he died shortly thereafter. But those facts, which were absolutely shocking to her, and she knew nothing about the Holocaust and almost nothing about the Jewish community and Jewish history in Lithuania, prompted her to launch a project called Being a Jew. The idea was to teach non-Jewish Lithuanian children of junior high and high school age about the Jewish people, Jewish history, Jewish traditions, Jewish holidays, etc., a little bit about the Holocaust. And she got a grant from the EU to do this program, but they obligated her to also include a conference on Holocaust education as part of the program. Now, she didn't know who to invite because she had never dealt with this issue. So she went to the people in Lithuania who was the so-called experts, and they told her very simply, you can invite whomever you want, except for two people. One of them was me, and the other one was David Katz, who was a professor of Yiddish in Vilna, who actually lost his post because of his involvement in trying to expose the lies of the government, etc. So Rūta, being Rūta, she's a bit of an iconoclast. She decided, of course, to invite us. And I couldn't come to the conference because I had already committed to a series of lectures in the United States. But I came to Vilna about a month before the conference to protest against the neo-Nazi march. And I said to myself, listen, you know what? Maybe I'll meet this woman. I hadn't been invited to speak in Lithuania in some 20 years, at least 20 years. And she's not only inviting me, she's offering me an honorarium. She wants to cover my expenses. I was just really curious about her. Anyway, so I went to meet her in Vilna the day after the demonstration. And she tells me that her relatives were involved, participants in the persecution of the Jews. And I nearly fell off my chair because in all the years I had been coming to Lithuania, and I came dozens and dozens of times, no one had ever told me or intimated that their relatives were in any way involved in the murder of the Jews. And this is so
I just want to pause you there because this is one thought which I think really, really is important. If you travel anywhere throughout Lithuania and you go through a village, you just have to think that somebody's grandparent, somebody's aunt, somebody's uncle was involved in some way or other. And it may be that they were just, taking people along that road to the ditch. They may have been a police commander. The point is that that generation of people all have awareness about what happened, but yet it's like a state secret. It's something that nobody ever talks about.
Exactly. That's exactly the case. And all of a sudden, this woman, whom I didn't know until that meeting, tells me that her relatives, two of them, were actively involved. And it was obvious that she was looking for a way to atone for this. And we started thinking, I had spent years trying to get the Lithuanians to put their unpunished collaborators on trial. And the truth of the matter was they had excellent opportunities because about 14 Lithuanians were stripped of their American citizenship and deported. And with one exception, they all went back to Lithuania. So in other words, the Americans had already done the infrastructure, legal infrastructure of a case like this, but they did everything possible not to prosecute them. All of them arrived in Lithuania healthy enough to stand trial, and the Lithuanians kept on delaying it. They passed 3 special laws in their parliament that you can investigate a genocide suspect even if they're not medically fit. You can charge them even if they're not medically fit, and you can have a trial on a video hookup. They didn't put a single person in jail one day even. It didn't.
Can you explain why that is? What is the mentality that perceives these, that would put these people in a light not as perpetrators, but in somehow defenders of the nation? Because that's really, it's a sort of very black and white situation, isn't it? Where that they can't see this ambiguity.
Let me give you one example. That's actually, there's a bit of controversy about it, but let me give you the version that I heard and I spoke about for many years. In Kaunas, in Kovna, the interwar capital of Lithuania, several days after the Nazi invasion, a group of Jews was seized, brought to a garage called Lietuvis Garage, where they were murdered before a huge crowd of men, women, and children, either by being beaten to death by crowbars or by having fire hoses shoved down their mouths and having their stomachs exploded. About 50, I think it was 52 Jewish men. And all this was taking place in front of an enthusiastic, cheering crowd. And at the conclusion, when all of these people were murdered, someone took out an accordion and they started playing what turns out to have been, at least according to one version, the Lithuanian national anthem. Now, I use this as an example of something which reflects what happened in Lithuania. And I often speak to teachers who come from all over the world to Yad Vashem, the Israeli National Memorial, to learn about the Holocaust and how to teach the Holocaust. And I ask these teachers, almost all of them are teachers, I say, what on earth is the connection between this murder and the Lithuanian national anthem? And the answer is ultra-patriotism. In other words, these murders were motivated, among other things, by ultra-patriotism. These people were convinced the Jews were the enemy. The Jews are preventing Lithuania, the progress of Lithuania, the advancement of Lithuanians in certain professions or whatever, economically. And they are saving their country from the Jews, a factor which was further complicated by the year of Soviet occupation. Because when the Soviets came, the Jews all of a sudden had entree to the civil service, for example. In Lithuania, they couldn't serve in the police. I mean, in theory, they could serve in the police, but they had, in other words, there was no way for them to reach positions of importance, not in the Lithuanian army, not in the Lithuanian police, not in the civil service. And now all of a sudden, all in the eyes of the communists, in the eyes of the Soviets, all people living in Lithuania were equal in a certain sense. So there were Jews who joined the structures that they had been barred from initially. And there's also a myth that the Jews greeted the Soviets, which isn't even true. The Lithuanians themselves greeted the Soviets, and the Lithuanian authorities told the Lithuanian people to help the Soviets when they entered Lithuania. So this myth of Judeo-Bolshevism was a very serious catalyst for some, quite a bit of the anti-Semitism.
Yeah. I want people to start putting questions in. There's the Q&A blocks below here. So if you just start putting your questions in there, soon we'll be able to open up the microphones. Efraim, I guess that's one of the key points, is that for many of these countries, and I'm thinking of Slovenia's example, Croatia, Ukraine, all these countries had communism for a good 50 years after the war, and the only independent nations they had were nationalists or directly allied with the Nazis. So in many ways, their sort of idea of independence is expressed or allied with the Nazi regime, and they can't seem to separate the two.
Listen, this was definitely one of the problems, because when these countries were liberated, in quotation marks, right, freed of the Nazi occupation, they simply replaced the Nazi occupation with either a Soviet occupation. We're talking about those countries that became Soviet republics: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus. And the other countries were under communist rule. So it was the communists who in a sense, created the narrative of World War II and the Holocaust. Now, I'm sure many of our listeners know that they didn't call it World War II in the Soviet Union. They called it the Great Patriotic War. And this was the battle of the ideological titans between communism and Nazism. And thank God, I have to say thank God, with the communists, with all their flaws and all their horrible things that they did, saved Europe from the Nazis, who were worse. But in any event, I'll give you one very important example. There was no acknowledgement in the Soviet Union of the unique fate of the Jews under the Nazis. That Jews had been singled out to be annihilated. Never acknowledged. Listen, I visited the Soviet Union in '85, and I made it my business to go to Lithuania and Latvia, as well as to Russian Federation, to St. Petersburg and Moscow. And I went to the mass murder sites. I went to Ponar. That's outside Vilna. I went to Rumbala, outside Riga. So there was a small monument in each case with the caption, "To the victims of fascism." Oh, very interesting. The victims of fascism. Well, that hides two very important elements: the identity of the perpetrators and the identity of the victims. I'll give you another example. Babi Yar, the site of the largest single day, or actually 2-day massacre, September 29th, 30th, 1941. The Nazis, Einsatzgruppe C, if I'm not mistaken, it's under Commando 10A, and Ukrainian security police carried out the murders of 33,771 people, primarily Jews, of course. Now, how do I know the number? Because there was an exhumation after the liberation. Now, for many years, there was nothing. And then some genius, in quotation marks, in the Kiev municipality came up with the idea of building a football stadium at Babi Yar. And if not for Yevgeny Yevtushenko, the Russian poet, who published his poem, his evocative poem, Babi Yar, speaking out on behalf of the victims, who knows, they might have even done it. So what did they do? Again, a little monument, victims of fascism. So this was the problem. In other words, the subjugated peoples of Eastern Europe did not exactly know the truth. I mean, they knew what happened in their country, certainly, but that was a very sad chapter. So when they made the transition to democracy, they faced 6 issues relating to the Holocaust. One was acknowledgement of guilt and apologizing. 2 was commemoration of the victims. 3 was a prosecution of the perpetrators who had not been prosecuted, those who hadn't. The Soviets prosecuted many of them. 4 was history. They had to rewrite the history because they had to throw out all the history books. They were all communist propaganda. 5 was education, the textbooks, same thing. And 6 was restitution. Now, what made this whole issue very, very sensitive was they knew from the very beginning that if they want to achieve their foreign policy objectives, which were to join NATO and the European Union, because no one else could protect them. In other words, what was the greatest fear? The fear was the return of the Russians. You think for a minute that little Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia could defend their country against the Russian army? That's absurd. So who can protect them? Either NATO or NATO and the European Union. But in their minds, it was very important to fix the fences with the Jews. Because the Jews, they thought, there's a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a fictitious account of a plot, a Jewish plot, to control the world. It was written by the Russian Secret Service in 1905. And the place where they really believe it is in Eastern Europe. So in other words, we have to make peace with the Jews. We have to fix our relations. And it was clear from the very beginning that the Holocaust was an issue. But how they're going to face the truth about the Holocaust, the truth was terrible. Mm-hmm. So what do? They try and dance around the controversial subjects. So if you were to go to any one of these countries, to one of the commemorations, they'll say, oh, the Holocaust, what a tragedy, terrible, absolutely terrible. The Nazis came to our country and murdered our Jews, boo-hoo. Okay, now that's true. And without the Nazis, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. But come on, that's not exactly what happened. So if you pressure
that brings us up to
let me just add one little piece. Nick. So in other words, if you put pressure on them and say, a few degenerates, marginal elements of our society, every society has its marginal elements.
Yeah. That brings us up to the present day and the way the book has been treated or received within Lithuania. And it echoes in many ways. I mean, what you were saying about education, I think is incredibly important. And throughout the last 30 years or so, I've been struck by the lack of knowledge of the Holocaust within countries across Eastern Europe. I mean, I remember in New Year's Day, 96, walking into a cafe or restaurant in Croatia and seeing commemorative photographs of the creation of the first Croatian SS unit with people all doing the Nazi salute. And you're thinking, hello, how is this possible? Then much later during the Maidan demonstrations, meeting young people who are in their early 20s, celebrating the nationalist heroes of Ukraine who were,
of course,
yeah, and the SS as well. So I'm continually shocked by the lack of knowledge about it. But in Lithuania, we see a country that is very much part of the EU, very close to the EU politically, and yet there is this antipathy to people digging up the past. And I know that Rūta, for one, has had a lot of difficulty in telling her story. Can you just talk a bit about that, how the book has been received in Lithuania?
So the only reason this book was published in Lithuanian, and it was published first in Lithuanian, was because Rūta had been writing her books for Alma Litera, which was the largest publisher in Lithuania. Now, all of her books, none of her books prior to Mūsiškiai, that means Our People, had in any way been connected to history. They were all like pop psychology. And her previous book before this one was a book of advice to women at 50, because in countries, the Baltic countries, especially outside the large cities, life really ends very early for these people. And They have terrible problems of drunkenness and suicide and all sorts of other problems. And it's as if their lives are over at a very young age. So Rūta wrote a book of advice telling them to go to the internet, try and find new love, etc. And the book sold 50,000 copies in a country of less than 2.5 million people. So that's amazing. So in other words, Rūta was the goose that laid the golden eggs. So the publisher wanted her, after the great success of her book on women, they wanted her to write a book about men. So Rūta had a meeting with them to tell them about this other book, right? So she told them, listen, I'll be happy to write a book about men, but first you have to publish the book I'm writing now. Ah, Rūta, wonderful, you're writing another book. What are you writing about? I'm writing about the Holocaust. Oh my God, what are you, nuts? So they said, okay, listen, okay, but you can't tell anybody what you're writing about until the book comes out. Now this was actually very wise advice. Because had the government known what she was up to, what we were up to, they would have done everything possible to try and block it. So Rūta found the headquarters of the Ypatinga Būris, which was the Lithuanian special unit that murdered 70,000 Jews at Ponar. It was an Italian restaurant in the heart of Vilna, and we had the launch there. She interviewed the two most popular Christian pastors, in other words, one Catholic, one evangelical, for this book, and they said all the right things. She launched the book. They printed 2,000 copies. Within 48 hours, it was sold. In other words, the press conference that we had to launch was something that people were absolutely couldn't understand what's going on. Rūta Vanagaitė, one of the most, if not the most popular author in Lithuania, who writes about pop psychology. Efraim Zuroff, the most hated Jew in Lithuania, who's busy hunting Nazis. Thomas Chernas, the pastor of the evangelical church. Ricardas Deveka, the most popular Catholic priest. And what are these people doing together, launching a book in an Italian restaurant? So it was unbelievable. I'm telling you, it took the country by shock. It was a total scandal. The head of national security in Lithuanian government went on national television saying that this book is a threat to national security. Because of course, now that this book tells the truth, Putin is going to come invade Lithuania. So it's either you're working for Putin, or you're working for the Jews, or you've lost your mind completely. Now, ultimately, they took revenge on Rūta. Not so quickly. It took 1.5 years. But when she questioned a government initiative to devote the year of 2018 to a hero of the Lithuanian resistance against the communists, a man named Adolfas Ramanauskas, she was interviewed, and she said she's not sure this is such a good idea because she had read his file in the KGB archives, and he had done some questionable, very questionable things. So next day, Alma Litera, the publisher, announces they are totally cutting relations with Rūta Vanagaitė. They are pulling all her 27,000 copies of her books. By the way, the day before, she had launched her autobiography, so there were 15,000 copies of that. There was our book and other books, and they're going to turn them into toilet paper. So that didn't happen because Rūta sued them to get the books back, but she stuck with them. No one wants to carry her books, and she's hardly sold any of them, and she lost her livelihood. And to top it off, the father of Lithuanian independence, Vytautas Landsbergis, wrote an op-ed in the most important, influential news portal in Lithuania, Delphi.lt, calling her Mrs. Dushansky. Dushansky was a Jewish KGB operator that served in the KGB in a high rank, and he was instrumental in bringing Nazi collaborators to justice. And he's also accused of torturing Lithuanian nationalists in '41. But he claims he wasn't even where these things took place, and recommended that Rūta, now that she's betrayed the country, go and commit suicide. So as you can imagine, I mean, Rūta was quite, scared. And ultimately, she came to live in Israel for quite some time. But I mean, listen, they basically ruined her life in a certain sense.
So just to sort of recap on this, her story is she's not able to sell the books. You'd say that the press coverage and the reception of the book has been negative. Has there been any positive? I mean, you talked about that initial press conference being very well received.
Very well received. Well, what we found was that there was a generational gap. In other words, many of the ultra-nationalists are the elderly generation. And you have to understand, one of the things they're trying to do in Lithuania is to create a false symmetry between communist crimes and Nazi crimes, and to claim that communist crimes are genocide. Now, that's very important, because if communist crimes are genocide, it means Jews committed genocide. They served in the KGB. In many cases, they wanted to avenge the deaths of the murder of their families. But in any event, so the younger people, those educated, those who grew up as, in the EU, educated later, let's put it like this, they were actually very curious. And many people, listen, 100,000 people read the book, because it was the most read book for quite some time in the public libraries. And people were waiting weeks and months to get copies of the book. But there's no question that, listen, when Rūta went to the book fair, that year, 2016, the Baltic Book Fair, the largest in the Baltics, she needed a guard. Alma Litera had to hire a guard for her. Mm. Who had to follow her everywhere, even to the bathroom.
Yeah.
So
I think for me, this was, this takes me back to my trip, and I was so shocked at the way that Lithuania dealt with its history, and it sort of chimed with my experience across other former Eastern Bloc areas of this sort of denial of what's happened in the past. And for me, when I heard about the book and I heard about the reception that Rūta had, I was surprised. Less so you, Efraim, because I know you're an abrasive character.
Me?
Yeah, you. Listen, I'd love. So everyone, please do put some questions in there. I think that's a very important chapter of your life, but also I'd like to talk to you a bit more also about the other things that you've done throughout your career, which as we said is a very long one. Can you just pick, just so people who don't know what you've done, 2 or 3 highlights? Can you give me some things that you think really do stand out if you look back over the last few decades?
Okay.
People you've tracked down, and also how you go about finding them as well.
Okay, so you have to understand that I work for an NGO, the Simon Wiesenthal Center. I can't prosecute anybody, but I can help make it happen. And that's my job. So people ask me, what's your job? What does your day look like? I say, I'm 1/3 detective. That means to find the people, because no one else is looking for them, except for the Germans now. 1/3 historian, that's my real profession. I have a PhD from the Hebrew University in the history of the Holocaust. And that prepared me for looking for the evidence, which is witnesses and documents, to help build a case. But a lot of my work is actually as a political lobbyist. In other words, to try and create political will in countries which are often very reluctant to bring Nazis to justice. Now, if you want to understand it, it's very simple. Compare a case of a 90-year-old Nazi with a serial killer. So let's assume one of the countries that I helped convince to bring Nazis to justice was, believe it or not, the United Kingdom. So let's assume for a minute that there's a serial killer on the loose in London, in Birmingham, in Cardiff, or wherever. I can assure you that the police will be out there trying to do everything possible to catch this person, because the common wisdom is that this person is likely to strike again, and that's the nature of serial killers, of course. But what are the chances of a 90-year-old Nazi killing anybody or harming anybody? Well, it's close to 0. And I can tell you from my own experience, we've never had a case of a 90-year-old Nazi who was involved in any particular crimes. So maybe with one exception. But in any event, the countries know that all they have to do is ignore people like me and the people who are supporting my cause, and the person will die. I mean, it's very obvious now, because here we had a trial in Hamburg, just concluded 2 weeks ago. The defendant was 93 years old. And
how old was he when he perpetrated the crime?
He was 17 when he became a guard in the Stutthof concentration camp. 17 years. He was tried in a juvenile court, by the way, in Hamburg. So, in other words, the bottom line is political will. Without political will to bring these people to justice, there'll be no justice. And so a lot of the work that I had to do was with my colleagues in the Wiesenthal Center is to try and create that political will. It's a very, very difficult uphill battle, I can tell you, especially in Eastern Europe. But if I have to choose the highlights, I have to say that I'm sorry I wasn't more successful. Sometimes I feel like apologizing to the victims. But I can point to several successes. So one success was that we were able to help convince Canada in 1987, Australia in 1989, and Great Britain in 1991 to pass special legislation to enable the prosecution on criminal charges of the Nazi war criminals who were living there. And I have to say, as part of the background and explanation, that usually, you know, when people talk about escaped Nazis, South America comes to mind. And it's true that many of the leading, most prominent Nazi criminals did emigrate to South America. What's less known is that they were actually given a choice of between South America, primarily Argentina, and the Middle East. And quite a few went to Egypt or to Syria, like Alois Brunner, for example, who's Eichmann's right-hand man, responsible for the deportation to death camps, 128,500 Jews from 4 different countries. So those are the prominent people. What most people don't realize is that there were tens of thousands, or let's put it this way, many thousands of Nazi collaborators, many of whom were actively involved in murder from Eastern Europe. And with the exception of the Croatians, I'll explain why in a second, they overwhelmingly went to the Anglo-Saxon democracies. Now, of those Anglo-Saxon democracies, the only important country where we did not find, we didn't find any Holocaust perpetrators was South Africa, because South Africa was closed to immigration after World War II. So we see, ironically, that the survivors often went to the same countries as did the killers, as did their tormentors. The United States, it's a minimum of 10,000 went to the United States. Canada, several thousand. Australia, several thousand. UK, at least several hundred, at least. I'm not even talking about the Nazi scientists and engineers who were brought to the West so that they wouldn't fall into the hands of the communists. I'm not talking about a select group of people who were trained as spies, who the CIA and Allied intelligence thought of parachuting back into their homelands to serve as spies against the communists, against the Soviet Union. The bulk of them were allowed to enter the West because of ignorance and apathy. Ignorance regarding the important role played by these people in the mass murder. You have to remember, the iconic images of the Holocaust in 45 were the camps that were liberated by the West. In other words, Bergen-Belsen liberated by the Brits, Mauthausen, Dachau, and Buchenwald liberated by the Americans. Those were the iconic messages. It was the Russians who liberated Auschwitz. Treblinka had been completely destroyed. There was nothing left. And the same was true of Belzec and Sobibor. Oh no, Sobibor, there was something left, but almost very little. So in other words, those were not brought to the knowledge of the Western societies. So it's the concentration camps. But 1.5 million Jews were murdered in the eastern areas by shooting, grenades, rifles, etc., face-to-face murder, personal murder. And this is something that is not that well known, unfortunately. And this is part of the reason why these countries are to some extent able to get away with this.
Yeah. Efraim, in my mind, there are sort of two competing things going on now. There's this necessity to remind people of the terrible history and the responsibility that nations have to their role in it, either their failure to prosecute people at the time or the role of their state or their people in the killings themselves. So that's what you're really highlighting at the moment. But the thing that is raised against you is that you're clutching at straws. If we take a 17-year-old prison camp guard, in terms of his responsibility for the Holocaust compared to the failure of Germany to prosecute key people back in the 50s and 60s, the comparison seems to be an extreme one. Why
my answer is the following.
Go after the 17-year-old?
If you have a crime committed by a gang, and for whatever reason, the head of the gang and some of the most guilty people are either killed or disappeared or ran away, that doesn't lessen the guilt of the other people who were accomplices, who were part of the crime. Given the rise of anti-Semitism, and given the fact, I'll tell you something interesting that initially I didn't think about, but I think it's really interesting. 1.5 million refugees came to Germany in the last few years from North Africa and the Middle East. These are people who are emigrating from countries with deep anti-Semitic traditions. These are people who believe that the Holocaust didn't take place. The trials that are taking place in Germany, and there have been 5 of them since a dramatic change in German prosecution policies allowing this. One had to be stopped because of health reasons, but the other 4 were all convicted. This is a fantastic lesson in democracy, in rule of law, in historical accuracy in the Holocaust. So I don't think for a minute that these trials will influence any of the older generation of these refugees. But these people came with their families. In most cases, they have middle-aged children, they have grandchildren. These people can watch these trials, and they're getting a lot of publicity. They're not being done secretly. And this is a really, really important lesson for them. So, and that's an added value. But again, listen, I would tell you what I've been saying for the last 40 years. The passage of time in no way diminishes the guilt of the killers. Old age should not afford protection for such people. Just because someone reached the age of 90 doesn't turn a murderer, or in some cases a mass murderer, into a righteous Gentile. We owe it to the victims. We owe it to the victims. You should see how important it is for the people who testified at this trial in Hamburg. I was there at the trial several times, and I'm in contact. I found 20 survivors of Stutthof for this trial that could be, ultimately witnesses. Or what in Germany there's this thing called co-plaintiffs, of people who lost first-degree relatives in the camp, and they, in a sense, joined the prosecution. So for these people, this is really a sense of closure. This is important. That's why, frankly, I was so upset when the person who was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison had his sentence suspended, which I think really was not the correct thing to do. As a matter of fact, none of the people who've been convicted in the last decade, and there's 4 of them, 2 from Auschwitz, 1 from Sobibor, that's Damian, and now this Bruno Day from Stutthof, they have not sat a single day in jail after being convicted. And I think that you need an element of punishment. It doesn't have to be forever, it doesn't have to be 5 years. It has to be there, at least symbolically. It's very, very important. And I would add, listen, it sends a message. You commit crimes like this, even many years later, you can be convicted, you can be punished, held accountable. These trials are important for the fight against denial, the fight against distortion. These are another thing is that international law recognized individual criminal responsibility. This is very important. Every court in the world, with one exception, totally rejected the superior order's defense. Okay? Because if you accept it, you're left with 1 criminal, or say 20 criminals or 40 criminals, which is absurd when there were hundreds of thousands of participants. And the last thing I say to you is the following. These are the last people on earth who deserve any sympathy. They had none for their victims, and when you look at them, don't see an elderly guy who's trying to look as sick as possible. Think of someone who, at the height of their physical strength, devoted their energies to killing innocent men, women, and children, some of whom were even older than they are today.
The issue I have with it, when I see people that old being put to trial, is not the fact that you are raising public awareness of it. It's not the fact that you are they are actually serving, they're facing their crimes and being sentenced for it. And I like to see that. But what I find difficult about it is the exceptionalism of the case when it comes to the Holocaust. There are other terrible crimes that are perpetrated throughout the world within the last decade, last 20 years, last 30 years. And there are mass killers wandering around in numerous countries around the world who we don't think about, who we don't give a damn about. So you and I have spoken about the Balkans.
Listen,
so I know there are lots
of
for a minute.
Okay, I went to Rwanda twice in the aftermath of the genocide. I served as an unofficial advisor to the Rwandan government to try and help them in terms of cases of people who ran away. No one is happier than me when I see that Kabuga was arrested in France and he's being brought to trial. And no one is sadder than me when I hear that Bizimana, it turns out, had died in Gabon or in Congo-Brazzaville. Okay? I fully identify with all these efforts and I support all these efforts. I, at one point, wanted to open up an office in Kigali, in Rwanda, to assist in the prosecution. But for whatever reason, and some of them are quite justified, we didn't do it, okay? All these tragedies need their Wiesenthal. And I can't be the Wiesenthal for every single tragedy. It's just impossible. I'm saying just humanly impossible. I apologize, really, to the victims in that sense. Everyone needs its Wiesenthal. I'll never forget, I was in Riga when we launched Operation Last Chance. Operation Last Chance is our program that offers money in return for information. And they kept on bothering me and saying, why don't you look for communist criminals? I say, why don't you look for communist criminals? You're the ones who suffered under the communists. I fully support the prosecution of communist criminals. I'm all for it. So what are you waiting for? Why is there no Wiesenthal, Latvian Wiesenthal? And the same in all these countries. By the way, let me just make a little paid political announcement that if anyone wants to follow me, I'm on Twitter at E, capital Z, UROFF. I'll be very happy if you follow our activities. And if you're interested in more information, we have a website at operationlastchance.org. That's wiesenthal.com.
Yeah, well, we'll send those links out to everyone as well after this. There's a recording that's sent out to people as well, so we'll send that out with the recording. Now, I've dominated the conversation here, and I really do need to see some questions from people, and you're being a very timid lot this morning, so either raise your hand, or I might just sort of pick on that. There's Nigel Harley, if we can bring Nigel Harley up, Anna Logan as well. So let's take Anna, your question first, Anna, and then Nigel. Go on, Anna.
I'm wondering if nobody else in Lithuania or outside it has written about this, about the Holocaust in Lithuania.
Good question. There are Lithuanian historians who more or less have written the truth about the events, but there's two problems. One is it's written in academic, scholarly work, and no one has read it. And it has had absolutely no impact on the government's narrative.
It's worth mentioning also, Efraim, the laws that have been introduced by the government to emphasize what you were talking about, which is trying to equate the crimes of the Nazis with the crimes of the Soviets. So in other words, it's called Holocaust inflation or genocidal inflation. It's the idea of raising, although the Soviets did perpetrate terrible crimes, particularly in Ukraine as well, over 1 million people killed in Ukraine by essentially being starved. But the idea is to say that these crimes are exactly the same as each other. And if you deny that, you can be persecuted for it. You can be actually...
Prosecuted, not persecuted.
Sorry, prosecuted, sorry.
Maybe. But listen, I'll give you an example of the Holodomor. Okay, you mentioned the famine in the Ukraine. Okay, the Ukrainians are now saying that there were 7 million victims. Now, why? First of all, it's more than the Holocaust, you understand? They're counting the unborn children. I mean, this is just outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. And what they're not admitting is that it wasn't directed against Ukrainians as Ukrainians. It was directed against an economic class, because Stalin wanted to collectivize the Ukraine, the rich breadbasket of Europe. And it was directed at them, not at the Ukrainians. But that's another argument.
Yeah, but it's important to emphasize that those laws are still in place, and so that
right.
The Holocaust in a way is being sort of devalued,
No
and
question.
the crimes of the Soviet occupiers are being inflated. We'll be back in the Baltics next year, and these are the issues we do look at within our tour there, and it's really fascinating to understand why they think the way they do. And it's also a place that you can go to, and unfortunately, you can actually find people in those villages who do have memories of what happened in the past. So
listen, I have to tell you one story from the book. Okay, we met a woman. I saw a woman everywhere. We were looking for people who were the right age, who had been alive during the war. I saw a woman leaving a grocery store, and I said to Rūta, "Listen, go talk to her. I don't speak Lithuanian. And ask her if she remembers anything." She told the following story. She grew up in this village, actually not far from where my grandfather was born. And she was in a family of 2 girls. And she was friendly with a Jewish family who also had 2 girls, the youngest of whom was her age. And when the decrees against the Jews started, there was a very intense discussion in their house about whether or not they can save her friend, whether the family can save her friend. So I said to her, through Rūta, I said to her, "Well, you must have been afraid of the Germans." She goes, "No, we were not afraid of the Germans. We could have hid her forever. We were afraid of our neighbors." And she started crying. Our hearts broke. You know what I mean? It was clear this woman had never told that story to anybody. And it's sitting on her heart for 75 years. In 2015, it was 70 years. And just to be able to tell it to someone who could identify with what she was saying seemed like an enormous relief to her. But that was the problem. In other words, her neighbors.
I don't get it. Afraid of her neighbors because of the implication of hiding them? I'm being
because you were hiding a Jew.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that was clear. That was the thing.
Yeah. Okay, Nigel Harley. Nigel. You have to unplug your microphone as well. Make sure your microphone works. Can you hear us, Nigel? Maybe he can't. I don't know if Nigel may be having problems. So I'll see if do raise your hand or pop a question into the question box. And whilst I'm waiting for more questions, can you talk about one person who got away, Efraim, and that's Albert Heim or you talk about him.
Oh, sorry.
Nigel, sorry, go ahead, Nigel. Yeah, I didn't know.
Sorry, just a little technical hitch there. Yeah, I really wanted to ask Efraim, what do you think is the most effective way of combating what is a really serious rise in anti-Semitism, sadly, in a lot of parts of Europe? Clearly these trials must have some impact, but what do you, in your own mind, feel is the best weapon?
What I've personally found, there's certain tools that we have in other words, in democratic society. The tools that we have, first of all, the law. In other words, laws have to be passed, and in many countries there are such laws against hate speech, against hate crimes, and they have to be implemented in a very strict way. In other words, people who commit such crimes have to pay for them. That's one aspect. 2 is education. In other words, sometimes people get the mistaken notion that Holocaust education is a panacea for all the crimes of society. Well, I have news for you, it's not. It can help, and it's important, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's being done correctly. I mean, I know there are plenty of places where they talk about the Holocaust and fail to mention it's that the Jews were the victims. In other words, they universalize it to death, which misses the message. In other words, it was not by accident that the Jews were chosen by the Nazis to be annihilated. Okay, there were all sorts of reasons which go to the sources of hate and the motivations that are created to murder innocent people. And the third thing is, the truth of the matter is, if we could bring the architects of the Third Reich and of the final solution to justice, unfortunately, as Nick mentioned, far too many of them escape justice. These trials would have quite an impact today, because knowledge of the Holocaust is much greater, sensitivity to the Holocaust is much greater, and it would really be very, very important. I found that in Croatia, when we brought Dinko Šakić, who was one of the commanders of Jasenovac, the worst concentration camp in the Balkans, to trial, it had more of an impact than any history book could ever have.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was asking you about Albert Heijn, which is maybe a slightly tangential thing, but there's an example of someone who got away.
You want examples of people who got away? Should I tell you about all the cases where guys died a week before the trial or in the middle of the investigation? Or listen, this is the most frustrating job in the world, I'm telling you.
But picking up on the last point, I mean, I think there's a contrast to be made. There's a huge debate about anti-Semitism in Western Europe, in UK, and in the US, and a lot of that has to do with criticism of Israel and Israeli policies. And sometimes the people who make those comments are being seen as anti-Semitic. But I would argue that within Eastern Europe, it's a much more profound problem, in the sense that there are many people who've got very little idea about the Holocaust, and anti-Semitism is far more open and unthinking, unquestioned.
Okay, first of all, with this we'll conclude, okay? We have to distinguish between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, there are three sources of anti-Semitism: the Muslim immigrants, the extreme right, and the extreme left. Now, the most lethal anti-Semitism has been by the Muslim immigrants and the far right. In other words, the most lethal attacks have come from those two sources. In terms of the left, it's more unfair criticism of Israel. Okay, first of all, people are free to criticize Israel. Israel is not a perfect country. Israel makes mistakes. Israel does things that are not correct. But if you focus only on Israel and you unfairly criticize it, that already is getting close, or is anti-Semitic. That's the point. So we're not afraid of the criticism. In many cases, we deserve criticism. Okay.
But the distinction with Eastern Europe is what? So what's the distinction?
So I'll explain. Eastern Europe, the only source of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe is the extreme right. In other words, there are no Muslim immigrants, or virtually no Muslim immigrants. They're not a factor. The left, extreme left, has been totally delegitimized with the fall of communism. What's left is traditional anti-Semitism. In other words, the Jews control the media, the Jews control this, the Jews control that, they're trying to steal our money, blah, blah, blah. They inspired the COVID-19 to make money off it. Listen, there's a fascinating situation today, unprecedented in Jewish history in Eastern Europe. They love Israel and they hate Jews. In other words, they hate their own Jews. They love Israel because they view Israel as the example of a small country which survives in a very hostile environment, has been able to stand up to all sorts of threats and to flourish. So they seek our help in terms of technology, in terms of agriculture, in terms of other things. And we foolishly ignore our history and give them a free ticket because of their votes in the EU and the UN.
I've got to say, I think Kiev, downtown Kiev, walking along, and there was a bookshop on the corner, bookshop cafe, you know, very trendy. Sit down, have a great coffee in there, and then you go into the back room, and there's this library, and you start taking some of the books down off the shelves, and your eyes just pop out on stalks, and you think this, and they're basically commemorating, you know, German atrocities, and also the Ukrainian participation in regiments and the resistance movements, as they would call it, during the war. And you think that it just wouldn't be possible for a bookshop like that to exist in Western Europe, and yet it's here.
That's
there
the
are
good
young
news.
people sitting, you know, young people sitting down, and young people think it's perfectly fine, no problem.
Listen, but Dara's birthday was just declared a national holiday in Ukraine not long ago.
Incredible, incredible. I think there we're going to wrap it up. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much indeed, Efraim. If anyone wants to stay online afterwards and share a few thoughts, please do. Our next talk is on this Thursday, the 6th of August at 3 p.m. BST, and that's how Trump lost the Midwest. In fact, it's about how Trump won the Midwest in 2016 and how he's about to lose the same voters who voted for him last time. And that's with Professors David Dulio and Dave Swenson, who are both political economists, and that's going to be a really good discussion. That's next Thursday at 3 p.m. Efraim, thank you very much. It's been really, really interesting. Great pleasure to spend some time with you, online albeit, and very much looking forward to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Glad to participate.
Great. Thank you very much. Bye for now. Bye, Efraim.
Bye.